Ah, you know, here's something about reading fiction that even some very intelligent people fail to get. If a fantasy story, for instance, deliberately omits a detailed explanation for the intrusion of the fantastic element, then the story is not about a rational explanation, and you need not worry about looking for one anymore. The meaning of the story lies elsewhere, and that's where you should be focusing your attention, because that is where you will find the meaning in that story. I once included the following paragraphs in a story called The Things About Shapes to Come, in which pregnant women start giving birth to geometrical shapes like cubes, spheres, and pyramids. Eventually, the phenomenon goes away, normal babies start being born, and the story tells you what its point is. But before the phenomenon ends, this is a direct quote from near the end of the story. Nobody ever came up with any reasonable scientific or theological explanation for the nearly 2 decades that saw such a drastic change in mankind's reproductive output. Nor did it seem all that important, as long as it never happened again. Explanations are perhaps best left to the philosophers, who persist in seeking meaning, even for those of life's mysteries that remain random or pointless, or so subtle in their inner workings that examining them is as destructive to the wonder as scattering the components of a pocket watch is to timekeeping. For all of us, meaning arrives in installments. It might be actual and it might be wishful thinking. We can only report the facts and hope that they provide closure. End quote. At which point I provide the final scene, which was the part I wanted to echo in the head of the reader. The final scene is an explanation of what emotional truth the story is actually about. Now, I still got complaints that I never provided the explanation. After those paragraphs came out and said, "Don't worry about it," after those paragraphs steered the readers in the direction I wanted their concerns to go, I still got complaints. And to those readers I replied, it was radiation from space. The most comic booky of all possible explanations, and it still sent them away satisfied. Richard Dawkins, not a dumb guy, tweeted scorn against Franz Kafka's story, The Metamorphosis, on the grounds that it never explained the precise mechanism that caused its protagonist, Joseph K., to take on the form of a giant insect. Apparently, he would not have been satisfied with anything less than a few pages explaining the precise mitochondrial transformations that affected the change, and he wanted them so much that he missed everything else the story is about. Folks, this is applicable to many genres. Don't always look for explanation. If the mysterious gunfighter who involves himself in the affairs of a western town says, "I seen towns tear themselves to pieces over something like this, and I said I was never going to let it happen again," and if the story doesn't then tell you exactly what Ringo has been through, the folks telling the story know that spending 20 minutes on that flashback is unnecessary, that the viewer should put something together in her head that'll patch the information hole. If the guy coming from war tells the girl he was going to marry, You don't want to marry me, Leona. You don't want to know what I've done. Then we don't need an entire aria about his crimes. If corpses have risen from the dead and started eating people, well, then, unless it's critical to know why, then we can honestly write it off as nightmare logic, something man will never know except in Night of the Living Dead, where it actually was radiation from space, or Dead Alive, where it was a bite from some Matrin rat. You don't know. You don't need to know. There is no reason you need to know what was in that briefcase in Pulp Fiction. Honestly, I think radiation from space is an idiotic explanation, but it works just fine as an explanation every time a detail is deliberately omitted, including in that Pulp Fiction scene and the story about the boy returning home from war. There are reasons that more concrete explanations can be kept vague, including the very real factor that the storyteller doesn't want you to focus on that trivia, but does want you to focus on whatever the story is emotionally and thematically about. Okay?